So far, all of the work we've done in this series has been using Vue's Options API. The way that the Options API works is within our Vue instances, we create an object, and within that object, we define special options that set up our instances. For example, we have options for our reactive data, which we set up via the data option. We also have things like computed properties, our watchers, our methods, basically all of those special Vue tools that are provided for us, we can define them as options within this object. And this way of organizing our application works fine in this simple example so far, but imagine we started to expand on this and add more features. Right, so let's say we added a feature that was keeping a score of our progress, where for more difficult words, we got more points and everything was added up. And maybe there's some point threshold we're looking to pass, something like that. If we started to integrate that, we would have to start to add more code for that feature. So within our data properties, we would add additional data properties for our score calculator. We might have some computed properties to work with that as well. We might have watchers, whatever we need to make that happen, we would have to integrate that into this structure. And as we did that, what would happen is we would then be splitting the code for a given feature over these different options. Right, so we'd have some code for the first feature, which was our global feedback message, and then we'd have some code here for our second feature, which was the high score. And we would see this in each of our options. So the end result is, as we're focusing on different features, we'd have to be jumping around to the different options, the different utilities that Vue provides to find the code for the feature that we're focusing on. And that can start to get a little confusing. To address this, Vue introduced another style of defining your Vue instances called the composition API. And what the composition API is going to allow us to do is essentially extract these Vue utilities separate from this object syntax so that we can define them organized around our features. And to envision this, let me just write a little hypothetical code up here. What it's going to look like this is, imagine we have feature A, and then within feature A, or within a section of code about feature A, we can define our data properties. We can define our computed properties, any of our methods, so on and so forth. We can define everything we need for feature A. And then after that, then we can focus on feature B and have its own set of data properties, its own set of computed properties, methods, watchers, etc., separate from feature A. Right? So then everything is organized together around the feature rather than divided out amongst these options. And the end result is a more logically structured application that's really going to be useful, again, as your application grows in complexity. In speaking to that, before we actually get into the Composition API, just a little bit of history. The Composition API was released in version 3 of Vue. Prior to that, the only thing we had was the Options API. And, speaking to that and hearing that history, you might wonder, well, is the Options API still relevant? Why not just do everything in the Composition API? And the answer to that question, it is very much still relevant in, small to medium scale applications. The Options API is perfectly sufficient. You're going to find a lot of developers are still creating projects using the Options API. There's lots of resources and tutorials online about the Options API. So it's a really good way to get into Vue, and it's important to know to understand how to work with Vue in general. But layering on the Composition API as a different style of structuring your applications is something that is worth looking into as you get further into your Vue development experiences, which is why we're covering it here towards the end of this series. Another preface I'll mention before we jump into our example is that if you're following along in the Vue documentation, you can actually toggle between the Options API and the Composition API in terms of instructions. I referenced this here in the notes that accompany this video. You can see a screenshot. Let's actually go over to the docs and look at this. All right, so here's that toggle. So if you're working in the Composition API, just make sure it's set to that. And then any of the instructions you're reading, when it's talking about syntax, it's going to give you the syntax in the Composition API, whereas the Options API, you could toggle back to that as needed. Now let's jump into our example. And what I'd like to do is just refactor our FlashWord application to use the composition API. And to do this, I'm actually going to make a copy of our existing application and work in that copy, just because we're kind of going in a different direction with the application. So I want to keep that original copy written in the Options API just to have it for reference as needed later. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take our FlashWord Vite directory that we've been working with. We're going to duplicate it into a new directory called FlashWord Comp API. And that's where we're going to be making all the changes that I'm going to be going over in this video. So following along in the notes, I'm going to borrow this command to copy that directory. I'm over in my command line window. I'm in the directory where all of my work I've been doing in this series exists. So I'm about to make a copy of this directory. So I'm going to paste that command and then list my directory contents again. You can see I now have FlashWord Comp API. So I'm going to move into that directory. And what I want to do is I want to clear out my node module subdirectory. Recall that this is the directory that npm manages. And right now, this has some code in it that's referencing the original FlashWord Vite directory. We want to basically redo any of those references to reference our new directory name. So we're just going to remove it and then have npm rebuild it in this new directory. All right, so to remove that, we'll do the remove command. We'll make it recursive so it removes everything in the directory, and we're removing node modules. All right, and then we're going to have node rebuild it, and we're going to do that with the command npm install. Give that a few moments to run. All right, we can ignore any warnings as we did when we first set up the project. We do want to just skim through here and make sure we don't have any errors, which we don't, so it looks like we're good. We can look at our directory contents again, and you can see that node modules directory is back. So now the next thing we'll do is we'll run npm run dev to start up our Vite development server within here. And it looks like I do have an error preventing this from starting just because of the little bit of pseudocode I was adding when I was talking a moment ago. So let me go clear that up. I'm going to first clear it up in my FlashWord Vite version so I can get rid of these notes. And then these little periods here I did to represent new code. I'll get rid of that. All right, and the error that's coming here is actually in my duplicated version. So I've got to add that to my working environment in my code editor here. So I'm going to say File, Add Folder to Workspace, and I'm just going to open up this new Comp API directory. And then I need to go in and find that App.vue file and make the same fixes here. All right, so that should be good. Let's go back and try to rebuild that. So I'm going to run npm run dev again. Perfect. So we've got our dev server running. Let's bring this up in the browser. All right, excellent. And this should just be working exactly as we left this application off in the previous video. So with that example set up, let's start with this app.vue file, updating it to use the composition API. And the way I'm going to do this is coming back to the notes for this video. I've actually got the code written for this out. So I'm going to bring this over, and then we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of the two different approaches. So I'm going to grab everything, starting with the starting script tag down to the closing script tag. In my code editor, I'm just going to make sure I'm in App.vue in my new version, in my FlashWord Comp API version. And I'm going to replace the script with what I just copied. And then I want to see these two files side by side. So I'm going to use my code editor's split pane feature. And then let's close out this tab. So the end result is here on the left, we have App.vue from our original version written using the Options API. And then on the right is our new version in our Comp API folder written using the Composition API. Just so I can see these better, I'm going to close the file browser. And then the other thing I'm going to do is for our words definition, because it's a somewhat long object, I'm just going to use the collapse feature just to condense that, just so we can see a better bird's eye view of everything in these files. And you can see here on the left in my original version, it's already collapsed. So that's what it did look like. And then it's been collapsed down. So with everything laid out in front of us, let's talk about the key differences between these different approaches. And the first difference you should observe is that in the Options API, we're creating this object that we're exporting, And within that object, we're defining special Vue utilities like our data properties, computed properties, watchers. Whereas in the composition API, the way we're accessing those Vue utilities is via these methods that we're importing. Right, so there's 3 methods we're importing from the Vue library: ref, computed, and watch. First method, ref, is how we're going to set up our data properties. And you can see that down here. We've got 4 data properties, which we're setting up just as regular JavaScript constants. We're setting them to be an invocation of that special ref method, and then to that we pass the value we want to initialize it as. So when we see a line like const correct count, and we set it to be ref of 0, this is the equivalent of what we did here in the Options API, where within data we said correct count 0. And with this, we should see all the same behavior that we saw with our data properties, and that it's going to be reactive. All right, so if correct count is altered somewhere else in this code, anywhere we're using correct count, we should see those alterations, those changes propagated and reflected wherever we're using it. Moving on, we've got computed properties, which you'll recall computed properties are basically just special functions that are going to be automatically invoked whenever data that we're referencing in those functions is changed. All right, so the way that we define our computed properties in the composition API is, again, we're just going to create a constant. We're going to set it to this computed method, which we're importing from the Vue library, and we're going to pass it the function that needs to be executed when its dependent data changes. All right, so the internal workings of this function we're setting it to is very similar to what we saw in our original version in terms of like the general algorithm of what we're doing here. One notable difference, though, is how we're referencing data within these functions, specifically our data properties. In the Options API, we had to reference our data properties via the special this keyword. All right, and that's because we were working in this object syntax. So if we wanted to reference other data within this object, we got to it via the this keyword. In the composition API, we're not working in this object syntax, so we don't use the this keyword, but we do have to include this additional value accessor. All right, we can't just access our computer property words directly. We have to get the value within there. The reason we have to do this is because when we set up a reactive reference using this ref method, it's creating an object from this. And within that object is all the functionality we need for our reactive data. So for us to get to the underlying value here, we just have to access it with this special value keyword. All right, from there, though, the algorithm's the same. We run our sorting function, we return that. Everything else works the same. We just reference our data properties within these functions a little bit differently. Another computer property example we see is our word count. And again, same principles here in terms of how we're setting this up. You can see we're accessing words again here. To get to the underlying value, we just say words.value, whereas in the Options API, we accessed it via this.words. After computed properties, we get onto watchers. And again, this is something we're importing from the Vue library. We're importing the special watch method. And in this case, we're not going to define a constant here because we're not like creating a watch value. Instead, we're just going to invoke this watch method and tell it what we want to watch. So what we want to watch is the correct count. And the second argument we're passing this watch method is parameters for what the new value is when correct count gets updated, as well as what it previously was. And this is not actually something we did in the Options API version, just because we didn't actually need to know that information. But if we did, just in the sake of making these two things the same, we could include them as parameters here as well. But it's not something we need internally in this function, so technically we don't need it in either of these versions, but just nice to know that you can access that data when working with watchers. And then finally, the last utility we needed was just to create a regular method. And in the Options API, we do put that under the methods option. But here in the composition API, we just define a regular method, just like we would any other JavaScript method. There's nothing special we need to import from Vue to make that happen. Just a plain old JavaScript method. Of course, within there, we can access our data properties that we've defined, so you can see how that is being used to update our correct count. But the method itself is just a plain JavaScript method. And that brings us to the end of our script and our JavaScript changes. If we continue to scroll down, we can look at the HTML template, which we didn't change anything there. And so that's an important thing to understand. whether you're using the composition or the options API, how you write your template and work with your Vue directives is going to work the same, including things like accessing data properties and computed properties. Because in the template, you never had to use things like the this keyword there. Same thing with the composition API. You don't have to use the special .value method to access the data. Basically, when this component is rendered by your build system, it's automatically going to reveal those underlying values for you, so you can just directly reference them. Now, a few minor points I want to cover in terms of differences here. Let's rewind a bit. I want to go to the very top and point out that when we're working with the composition API, we do want to include this special attribute called setup as part of our script. This just saves us a couple steps. It's just telling our build system that this is using the composition API, and that is going to handle all of these constants that we're defining here and making sure that they're going to be registered properly when we're using this component. If we don't include this setup attribute, we would actually have to set up our application similarly to how we did with the options API, but we would add this extra setup method here, and this is where we would define our data properties, computer properties, watchers, so on, and then we'd have to return them. It's just more syntax that we'd have to worry about. So this setup attribute here just kind of makes some magic happen in terms of our application and simplifies the amount of code that we have to write. But long story short, just include it there when you're using the composition API. Another small difference between these two approaches is in the options API, when you're importing other single file components to use, you do have to explicitly register them as part of your options. Whereas with the composition API, we don't have to do that. All we have to do is import that single file component, and then it's available for use. So down here in our template, when we're using the word card, this should just work as expected. No registration step needed. In fact, let's test this out. Let's make sure that the code we've written here is actually working in this version. So coming back to the browser, let's actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to update the title here just to make sure it's clear I'm running the correct application. So let me bring back my file browser. And I'm going to go into the index file within my comp API version. And I'm going to update this, and we'll call it Flashword Composition API. So we're going to save that. And then there we go. We can see the title updated there, so we know we're working in the right version. And just going to go through and test all of our functionality. And looks like all of our word cards are showing and working as expected, as well as all of our completion message features that we were working with in App.vue. And with that working, let's just recap and make sure we understand the difference between the options API and the composition API, specifically what it's getting us. And to do this, let's go back to the notes that accompany this video. I've got a section down here under what does this get us that reiterates some of the points I was making at the beginning of this video of just how the composition API allows you to organize your application around features rather than options. And here I'm imagining a hypothetical. Let's say we're building an e-commerce site and we had two features, a search feature and an add to cart feature. If we were working with the options API, this is how we would have to organize our code. Where within our data options, we would have all the data for our search feature, and then we'd have to have all the data for our add to cart feature. Same thing with our computer properties. We'd have to divide out what we needed for that for our respective features. And the end result is that the code for our different features is spread throughout the application, right? So in 3 separate places here, we have all the code for our search features. In 3 separate places, we have all the code for our add to cart. So you end up having to jump around a bunch. Whereas if we imagine this refactored in the composition API, we could build all the code for our search feature in one spot where we have our reactive data, computer properties, watchers. Same thing for add to cart. We could organize all of the utilities it needs together. And then this just makes for a much more logical outline of our application. Another advantage beyond organization is just that composition API opens us up to better code reusability, because we're able to access our Vue utilities outside the context of a Vue instance. And when we can do that, we can create like dedicated function files that handle specific features and then just import them as needed into our components, into our Vue instances. This is often referred to as composition functions, which it's beyond the scope of what we're talking about in this intro video here, but I did just want to mention it that, again, beyond organization, the other thing that the composition API opens us up to is just better reusability and modularity when it comes to our code, which is always a good thing as we're thinking about bigger and more complex applications. Now, to wrap up this discussion, the last thing I would like to do is let's also update our WordCard single file component to use the composition API, just because there's a couple additional features I want to talk about when it comes to working with child components in terms of working with things like our props and the ability to emit events to parent components. So again, to expedite things, I'm just going to copy this pre-written code from the notes. So I'm going to grab everything in the script element. And then let's open up our WordCard component, making sure I'm in the comp API version. And I'm going to replace the existing script element with this updated version. And let me close this other pane just so we can focus on this file. And before we dig in the specifics here, let me actually jump back to the component within the Options API context, just to refresh our memory of what we've got here. So we've got a component. The main thing going on here is we have a prop called word that we're making accessible within this component. So when it's invoked by a parent component, that parent component needs to provide this information. And then within here, we just had a method to check answer that is going to reference that word prop. It does it via the this keyword. And that's really it here. We weren't doing anything with computer properties or watchers, just a method and a prop. Right, so now the equivalent in the composition API is here's how we're going to define props in the composition API. We're going to use this special define props function, or they call it a macro. And that just means it's going to be globally available in your components, assuming you are using the setup attribute. You don't have to import this as a method like we did with things like ref, computed, and watch, where we had to import them from the Vue library. We don't have to do that with define prompts. It's just available. Which, as a footnote, that kind of drives me crazy. Like, why is this a particular macro that's global, whereas these other things have to be imported? Not really sure of the principles behind that, the advantages behind that. To me, it just makes it a little bit more confusing when you're learning about it to understand, okay, well, which methods do I have to import versus those that I don't? But anyway, I digress. That's a whole other thing. Takeaway here is just, this is how we set up our props. We just create a constant. Logically, I'm going to call it props. We use the define props macro, and then we can pass in an array of prop data that we're expecting this component to get. In this case, that's just a single prop called word. Then when we want to use it or reference it in our code, we're just going to reference it via the constant we created. So props dot, and then whatever the name of the property is. That'll give us access to that data. Now recall that props is how we pass information to our components. And then when we need to communicate data from our child components up to parent components, we emit events. And the syntax in the composition API is we need to actually define what events we might want to emit. And we do that with another macro. This one, it's called define emits. And then again, we just give it an array of different events we might want to emit. And then the way that we can emit them is down here. We will just reference this emit constant we came up with, and then the name of the event. So if we compare this to how we did in the Options API, in my opinion, this actually gets a little bit more complicated, because back in the Options API, all we had to do is just reference this .emit, and then we could come up with whatever event name we wanted. We didn't have to register it ahead of time. But this additional step is necessary in the composition API, just based on how things are working behind the scenes. All right, so those are the two things to understand about child components and the composition APIs, just how to work with props and events. When it comes to using this child component and passing in props and receiving events, everything's going to stay the same there. If we go back to App.vue, if we look at WordCard, when we pass in the prop in our template, nothing changes there. Same thing with when we're listening for the increment correct count event, we're using the same syntax there. Nothing with any of these changes to the composition API has required any changes in the template itself. And with that, that's all I have to say about the composition API, at least in this beginner series. If you want to dig further into this, I do have some articles at the end of the notes that might be of interest. The first is to a FAQ in the Vue docs about the composition API. The second is an external article that talks about when you might want to use the composition API versus sticking with the Options API. And both do a good job of just reiterating some of the points I was talking about at the beginning of the video when comparing these two different approaches. Looking beyond the composition API, though, and this series, in the next video, we're going to wrap things up. I have some useful tips I want to leave you with. I want to show you some web developer tools that are going to be really helpful when working with Vue applications. We're going to talk about some debugging tips, just some good wrap-up things to send you on your way. And speaking to that, I will also talk about what you might want to look at next beyond this series as you're continuing down your path of Vue development.